While I was standing at my mother's graveside, my key stopped working on my own front door. My name is Farah, and by the time I got home from burying my mother, my husband's family had already moved half my belongings into the garage, changed the locks, and started referring to the house, my house, in my name, bought with my inheritance from my grandmother, as the family home. This story does not slow down. Stick with me. Fast context, because the pace only builds from here. My husband Grant and I had been married 6 years. I'd bought our house 4 years ago, outright, no mortgage, using an inheritance from my grandmother that came through right around the time we were house hunting. A genuine stroke of fortune that let us skip the entire mortgage process and move into a house I loved from the very first walkthrough. The deed was in my name alone. My grandmother's estate lawyer had recommended it at the time, mostly for straightforward inheritance tracing reasons, and Grant had never once, in 4 years, treated it as anything other than our house in every practical, day-to-day sense. We hosted holidays there. We renovated the kitchen together. It was ours, functionally, even if the paperwork technically said otherwise. Grant's family, his mother Deborah especially, had always had what I'd describe as a complicated relationship with boundaries. Deborah called constantly, dropped by unannounced with a regularity that Grant found endearing and I found, over the years, increasingly exhausting, and had, on more than one occasion, made comments about how a house should really be in both names for a real family. Comments I'd always brushed off as old-fashioned rather than anything more calculated. My mother died after a long illness, 3 weeks of hospice care that Grant and I both took time off work to help manage. The funeral was on a Thursday. I want to tell you about that morning specifically, because it's the last completely normal morning I had before everything after it became strange. Grant told me, that morning, that he needed to swing by his mom's place quickly before the service to grab something, and that he'd meet me at the funeral home directly rather than riding with me. I didn't think anything of it. It was a fairly mundane logistical detail on a day that had much larger things occupying my attention. I drove to the funeral home alone, sat through the service in the specific, muffled fog of grief that makes an entire afternoon feel like it's happening to someone else, buried my mother, and drove home afterward wanting nothing in the world except to be inside my own house, alone, in silence, for the rest of that day. My key didn't turn. I want to describe this moment carefully because I think the specific, mundane physical sensation of it, standing on your own porch, black funeral dress still on, key simply not fitting a lock it had opened every single day for 4 years, is such a strange, small detail to be the opening note of something enormous, and yet it was. I tried the key 3 more times, genuinely assuming, in the fog of the day, that I was somehow doing it wrong, my hands unsteady, my brain elsewhere. It did not turn. I knocked, confused, exhausted, still not remotely understanding what was happening. And after a long moment the door opened, from the inside, and Deborah, my mother-in-law, stood there in my own front hallway, looking at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully, deliberately composed. "Farah, come in, come in. We didn't want you standing out there." "Why did my key not work?" I said, my voice coming out flatter and more confused than angry, because I genuinely had not caught up yet to what was actually happening. "We had the locks changed this morning," she said, as though this were an entirely unremarkable piece of household maintenance. "Grant and I talked about it, given everything going on with your mom's estate and the house situation, and we thought it made sense to get ahead of some things while everyone's dealing with a lot at once." I stood in my own doorway, in my funeral clothes, hours removed from burying my mother, being told by my mother-in-law that the house situation had apparently required a lock change. On the day of my mother's funeral, without a single word of warning to me beforehand. I want to walk you through exactly what I found once I actually got inside, because it escalated fast, and it did not stop escalating for the rest of that day. Boxes, several of them, stacked in the front hallway, my own handwriting nowhere on any of them because I hadn't packed a single one. Someone else had gone through my closet, my bathroom cabinet, a shelf of books in the living room that had been mine specifically, going back to childhood, and packed a selection of my personal belongings into boxes now sitting by the front door like luggage waiting to be collected. "What is this?" I asked, gesturing at the boxes, still not fully able to process the scale of what was unfolding around me. Deborah's expression shifted, just slightly, into something more careful. "We thought, given everything, it might make sense for you to stay with your sister for a little while, just while things get sorted out. It's a lot, grief in a big house and everything with your mom's estate all at once, and Grant and I agreed it would be easier on you." "Grant and I agreed," I repeated. "Where is Grant?" "He was in the kitchen. My kitchen, the one I'd renovated with my own money, my own choices, down to the specific shade of the backsplash tile. Sitting at the table, not meeting my eyes when I walked in, which told me, faster and more completely than anything Deborah had said, that whatever was happening had his knowledge and, apparently, his participation. Grant, what is going on? Why are there boxes of my things by the front door? Why did the locks get changed? He was quiet for a long moment. The specific quiet of someone who has clearly rehearsed a version of this conversation in his head and is now discovering, in real time, that the actual moment feels much worse than the rehearsal. Mom thinks, we think, it makes sense to formalize some things about the house. Given your mom's estate is probably going to bring some money into the picture, and mom's lawyer said it would protect everyone if things were clearer before that all gets finalized. I want to be precise here, because this is the detail that reframed the entire day for me, transforming it from a strange, upsetting overreach into something with real, calculated intention behind it. My mother's estate. My mother, who had just died that morning, whose funeral I had just returned from, had a modest but real-life insurance policy and a small retirement account that I was the sole named beneficiary of. And Grant's family, apparently, had spent some period of time. I would later learn it was closer to 2 weeks, meaning they had begun this planning while my mother was still actively in hospice, still alive, discussing how best to position themselves relative to money I hadn't even received yet, money that existed, at that point, only as a future certainty tied to a death I was actively grieving. You changed the locks on my house, I said, on the day of my mother's funeral, because you were worried about protecting yourselves from money you think I'm about to inherit. Grant didn't have a good answer for that, because there isn't one. Deborah, for her part, tried to reframe it several more times over the following hour, protecting the family, getting ahead of complicated legal questions, making sure everyone's on the same page before emotions run higher, language that I've come to recognize, in the months since, as the specific vocabulary people reach for when they know, on some level, that what they're doing cannot survive being described plainly. I called a locksmith myself, that same evening, from my car, sitting in my own driveway, because I genuinely did not feel able to be inside that house for another minute. He came within the hour, and I want to tell you that watching a stranger rekey the locks on my own front door, on the day I buried my mother, while my mother-in-law watched from the front window with an expression somewhere between disapproval and disbelief, is one of the strangest, most surreal images I carry from that entire period of my life. I want to skip ahead slightly through the parts you can probably imagine, the excruciating conversation with Grant that stretched across the following 3 days. The moment I pulled the actual property deed and showed him, plainly, my name and only my name on it. The specific silence that fell over that conversation once the paperwork made unambiguously clear that nothing about protecting the family had any legal basis at all, because there was nothing to protect that wasn't already, entirely, unambiguously mine. Because I think the more important part of this story is what came out over the following weeks, once I started actually asking questions, rather than simply reacting to what was happening in front of me. I learned, through a conversation with Grant's younger sister, who called me about 10 days after the funeral, clearly uncomfortable with what had happened and wanting, I think, to unburden herself of some of it, that the lock change had not been a spontaneous decision made that single morning. Deborah had actually consulted an attorney, her own, not a joint family attorney, a detail that mattered a great deal once I understood it. Roughly 2 weeks earlier, while my mother was in her final days of hospice, specifically to ask what legal standing, if any, existed for protecting family assets in the event that a spouse's inheritance created what she apparently described to the attorney as complications for the marriage going forward. I sat with that detail for a long time. My mother-in-law had, while I was spending my final 2 weeks with my dying mother, been quietly consulting a lawyer about how to position herself and her son relative to money I hadn't yet received, from a death I hadn't yet fully grieved, and had used the exact morning of the funeral, a day she knew, with absolute certainty, that I would be out of the house for hours, distracted, exhausted, emotionally unavailable to react in real time, as the specific window to execute whatever plan had come out of that consultation. I confronted Grant directly about his role in all of this, because the lock change itself, whatever his mother's underlying motivations, could not have happened without his active participation. His name wasn't on the deed either, which meant he had no more legal standing to authorize a locksmith than his mother did, and yet he'd clearly been present for, and complicit in, the entire operation. His explanation, delivered quietly, over several increasingly difficult conversations, amounted to something I've come to recognize, in the months since, as depressingly common in these situations. He hadn't fully agreed with his mother's framing, he said, but he hadn't stopped her either, because he'd let himself get talked into believing there was some reasonable, protective logic underneath what she was proposing, and because, and this is the part that genuinely broke something in our relationship in a way I don't think fully repaired. He had simply found it easier, in the exhausting, grief-heavy days of my mother's decline, to let his mother handle the logistics of something he didn't want to think too hard about himself. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, even though it's less dramatic than the initial confrontation. I didn't file for divorce immediately, though I understand why some people reading this might expect that to be the obvious next step. I gave it time, real, deliberate time, with a couples therapist, trying to determine whether what had happened was a singular, grief-adjacent catastrophic error in judgment or a reflection of something more fundamentally broken in how Grant and his mother related to boundaries, money, and me specifically. What I learned, over about 4 months of trying to work through it, was the latter. Deborah did not, at any point, offer anything resembling a genuine apology. The closest she came was telling me, at a family dinner about 2 months later, that she still didn't think it was that big a deal, in the grand scheme of things. A sentence that told me everything I needed to know about how she would likely continue to operate for the rest of however long Grant and I stayed married. And Grant, while genuinely remorseful in the moment, showed a consistent, specific pattern over those 4 months of quietly deferring to his mother's version of events whenever the two of them were in the same room. A pattern I don't think he was even fully aware he was doing, but one I could not unsee once I started actively watching for it. I filed for divorce 5 months after my mother's funeral. I want to be honest that it wasn't solely about the lock change itself. It was about everything the lock change revealed, all at once, about how thoroughly my own boundaries, my own legal ownership, my own basic right to grieve my mother without someone rearranging my life in my absence, had been treated as negotiable the moment real money entered the picture. I kept the house. Obviously, the deed made that a formality rather than a fight, though the divorce process itself was, unsurprisingly, contentious in almost every other respect. I changed the locks one more time, for what I hope will be the final time, about a week after Grant moved his remaining things out. It's been about a year now. I started therapy shortly after the funeral itself, initially just to process my mother's death, and ended up spending a significant portion of those sessions instead on the specific, compounding disorientation of grieving one loss, while simultaneously discovering that people I'd trusted completely had used that exact period of vulnerability to advance their own interests. My therapist has helped me understand that the two griefs, my mother's death and the slow-motion collapse of my marriage, were never actually separate processes, even though they felt, at the time, like two entirely different crises happening to coincide. The same vulnerability that made me an easy target for the lock change is the same vulnerability grief creates in anyone, and there is no reasonable amount of vigilance that protects you from people who are willing to specifically exploit that window rather than support you through it. I think, more than anything, about standing on my own porch that afternoon, key not turning, still in my funeral clothes, genuinely, initially, assuming it was some small mechanical failure rather than a deliberate, planned act. I think about how long it took me to fully catch up to what was actually happening, because grief had already slowed every part of my thinking down, and how precisely that slowness had, apparently, been factored into the timing of the entire plan. My sister said something to me a few months after everything fully came apart that I still think about often. She said, "You didn't lose your marriage because of one bad day, Farah. You lost it because one bad day finally showed you something that had probably always been true. The locks just made it impossible to keep looking away from it." I didn't fully believe her at the time. I believe her more now, a year out, with enough distance to see the shape of what that single afternoon actually revealed, rather than only the shock of the afternoon itself. If you've ever come home from the worst day of your life to find that the people closest to you had used your absence to quietly rearrange something that was supposed to be yours, I want to hear about it. I think there's something particularly devastating about betrayals that are timed deliberately around your grief, engineered specifically for the exact hours you're least equipped to notice or resist them, and something important about learning, the way I eventually did, that the timing itself is never actually an accident. One funeral, one changed lock. That's all it took to learn exactly how much of my life certain people believed they were entitled to the moment I wasn't looking.